It's a delight to see so many people assembled to pay tribute to my old friend and colleague, Arthur Prior. And all I'm going to do is to give you a few personal reminiscences of Arthur Prior, and just to make one or two concluding suggestions from a theoretical point of view. I first learnt of the existence of Arthur Prior approximately 60 years ago. In the academic year 1954 to 5, I was then a student in the Gregorian University in Rome in the final year of studies for the licentiate in theology. And in one's final year, one had to do a small dissertation of about 30,000 words. And I chose to do it on the topic of the logical status of propositions about God. And I spent quite a lot of time reading analytic philosophy of religion in periodicals like Mind and Philosophy. I read them in the library of the British Council in the Via Quattrofontane in Rome. And I soon found that one of the most interesting writers on the philosophy of religion was Arthur Prior, with in particular two papers, Can Religion Be Discussed of 1948 and Is Necessary Existence Possible of 1953. Later on, as a graduate student in Rome, I did a dissertation on the linguistic analysis of theological statements, and into my doctoral thesis I incorporated discussion of Prior's work. At the time when I was writing that thesis, I was a student priest in Rome. I discovered later that Arthur Prior had also come to philosophy from a religious background. He was the grandson of two Methodist missionaries, and as a student in Otago in the mid-30s, he was very active in the student Christian movement as a Christian socialist. In 1937, he married a fellow Christian socialist, Claire, and the two of them, so far as I was able to discover, set out on a worldwide bohemian trip, supporting themselves by religious journalism. I didn't actually know it was possible to support oneself in that way, but apparently they did in their rather simple bohemian lifestyle. But though we both moved from religion to philosophy, Arthur's experience was very much wider than mine. I went straight from being a priest to being a don, but he was in between. He was a railwayman, a dock labourer, a hotel bellhop, and of course a member of the Royal New Zealand Air Force during the war. He became a philosophy teacher in 1946 at Canterbury University at Christchurch. By this time, he had been divorced from Claire and begun his long and happy marriage with Mary, about whom Peirce spoke so warmly earlier on. The first common friend that Arthur and I had was Gilbert Ryle, the professor of metaphysics in Oxford at that time. In 1954, Arthur hosted a visit to New Zealand by Ryle. Ryle was very impressed by him and invited him to Oxford to give the John Locke lectures in 1956. It was at that time, during that visit, I think, that this first International Logic Conference, which Per mentioned, was held here. You queried the location of room 21, this being room 23, that's to say the room on staircase 23. The old staircase 21, which was across by the back gate, it was demolished some years later. It was a pseudo Elizabethan sort of manor house, completely inappropriate, though historically quite attractive, and it was demolished probably illegally, I think, late overnight, in order to make room for the less quaint and in some ways less attractive buildings that are now across the way. Of course, the John Locke lectures became Time and Modality in 1957, which I think was the first book of Arthur Prior's really to make a great impact, though he had earlier written Logic and the Basis of Ethics. In 1957 to 9, just after Arthur's visit here, I became a graduate student in Oxford, and Ryle was extremely kind to me. He used to send me papers of his before publication. I attended his seminars, and when eventually I left the priesthood and was without a job, Ryle made efforts to find me a job in Oxford and offered me financial support if I couldn't find one. Luckily, I found one soon enough not to need it. Now, towards the end of my period as a graduate student, in 1959, the Priors left New Zealand, and Arthur took up a newly founded chair of philosophy at Manchester as a colleague of Dorothy Emmett. It was in 1959 that I first met Arthur and Mary. I was introduced to them by Peter Geach and his wife Elizabeth Anscombe. Prior's book, Formal Logic, had been published by then. I knew and admired the book, and I was converted for a time by reading that book to the Polish notation, which Arthur used in tribute to Łukasiewicz. He used to refer to it as the handy Polish notation. There was a sense in which at that time it was very handy. It was the only notation that you could use on an ordinary typewriter without extra characters for quantifiers and so on. And also, I still think that it is very attractive for simple logical exercises, in that detachment is so easy. Around about this time, I was hospitalized with jaundice for 6 weeks, and I entertained myself by doing logical exercises in the Polish notation. This gave considerable concern to my doctors, who thought it was a sign of madness. And so I was quickly sent an occupational therapist, who was a very beautiful young woman who showed me how to do charcoal drawings instead of logical exercises. Well, having admired Arthur first as a philosopher and then as a logician from a distance, I was astonished and delighted to find that this great man was so completely informal and friendly, lacking any pomp or ego. Shortly after meeting the Priors, I finished my graduate studies in Oxford, and they were succeeded by 4 unhappy years as a Roman Catholic curate in Liverpool. During those years, I became more and more uncertain of my vocation and eventually decided that I had to leave the priesthood. Arthur and Mary Prior were extraordinarily kind to me during this period. They were in Manchester, I was in Liverpool, so it was not a great distance. But one way in which they were helpful was that Arthur himself had been through a comparable religious crisis slightly earlier. He had, in his late New Zealand years, become a Presbyterian elder, but when they came to England, the priors severed their connection with the Presbyterian Church, and so they had trodden a very parallel path to mine. While I was a curate in Liverpool, I did have a part-time post at Liverpool University, providing maternity cover for a lecturer there. After that expired, Arthur arranged for me to give a series of lectures at Manchester in the philosophy department there. There was a kind of consortium of universities, Liverpool, Manchester and Leeds, and there would be joint seminars. And I gave a set of lectures there. They were essentially chapters from my thesis on the intentionality of psychological verbs, which was later published as Action, Emotion and Will. I think there's at least one person in this room, I think, who heard some of those lectures. I would take holidays during these years as a curate. I would take holidays with the priors, sometimes in their cottage in Shropshire, but more often on canal cruises. The priors introduced me to the pleasures of cruising on narrow boats, particularly on the Shropshire Union Canal, the Shroppy, and its most agreeable tributary, the Llangollen Canal. Another participant was the New Zealand philosopher Michael Hinton. Mary acquired on these canal trips an interest in the history and sociology of the canal people, which she later worked up into a book in particular about the Oxford Canal people. But at that time she was collecting legends and songs and jargon of the boat people. I remember one song which she would sing, of which the chorus was, "Boaty, boaty, spit in the cut and wipe your nose on a mopstick." Quite what it meant, I was never clear, but it was obviously meant to express contempt for the very uncouth canal people. In 1963, I told my bishop I wanted to leave the church. I was briefly sent to Rome to cool my heels by the Archbishop, see if I would change my mind. And at that time, I was given great support by Arthur and Mary, regular letters full of good advice. And when I returned, having got myself officially unfrocked, they invited me to live with them, since naturally I didn't want to go back to the presbytery where I had been living. And I had happy weeks at the prior's house in Manchester, picking up the pieces of my life. I have two particular memories of that time. The first is of a tour of England that Arthur arranged for Sol Kripke. I think it was Kripke's first trip abroad. In my memory, he was a teenager, but I've actually checked the dates, and he was 23. So I was obviously collapsing the fact that Kripke made his contributions to modal logic while he was still a teenager, with his still rather juvenile appearance when he when he visited us in Manchester. I also remember that the kitchen had to be cleaned out because he, I don't know whether he still does, he then kept a very kosher diet, and I remember using from washing powder for many weeks after he had left. The other memory is a day that all of us who were then alive are supposed to remember vividly, namely the assassination of John F. Kennedy. I do remember it quite vividly. Arthur and Mary and I were at a theatrical performance, I think, of Robert Boat's Man for All Seasons. And at the interval, it was announced that Kennedy had been assassinated. We then came back to the prior's house, where there were two American students had rented some rooms at the time. And Mary knocked on the door to give them the news. There was a few moments of silence after the news, and then the student said, well, actually we're Republicans ourselves, but nonetheless we wouldn't have wanted that to happen. Both in Manchester and Oxford, the priors were extremely generous to students. They kept open house and never drew a sharp distinction between professional life and social life. I became a fellow of this college about 9 months after I gave up the priesthood. I was a lecturer at Exeter and became very much happier than I had been. After I'd been here a couple of years, the professorship of moral philosophy became vacant. It had been held by Neil, William Neil, the logician essentially, it was advertised. I had, by this time, been a fellow of Balliol for 2 years, and I taught in the honour school of politics, philosophy, and economics. Then, as now, it was not possible for an undergraduate in Oxford to study philosophy alone. There were 2 courses that you could take. One focused on ancient philosophy, called Literae Humaniores, and one focused on modern and contemporary philosophy, the PPE, or Politics, Philosophy and Economics. Richard Hare was my colleague. He taught the ancient philosophy group, and I taught with Alan Montefiore, I taught the modern philosophy group. Well, when Neil retired in 1965, both Arthur Prior and Elizabeth Anscombe applied for the chair. But in fact, the electors appointed Richard Hare. I had a pretty grumpy letter from Arthur in connection with this, saying he wouldn't in the least have minded being beaten by Elizabeth Anscombe, for whom he had a great respect. But Hare, he said. The fact that Hare, as a professor, moved to another college, Corpus Christi, meant that there was a vacancy for a philosopher at Balliol. I saw an opportunity. I saw 2 opportunities. One was that I could move to teaching the ancient philosophy, which I liked much better than modern philosophy, taking up Hare's fellowship. And then we could advertise for the new philosopher without insisting that the new philosopher must know Greek. This, of course, made it possible for Arthur Prior to apply, and he needed very little encouragement from me to put his name in. And he was warmly, his application was very warmly welcomed by my colleagues here, and he was elected, so far as I remember, more or less without competition. The arrival of the Priors in Oxford gave them yet another occasion to show me great kindness. In April 1966, I married my wife, now as then, Nancy Kenny, and having married, I had no house to live in. I had been living as a bachelor don on staircase 17 across the way. Arthur and Mary, in preparation for coming down to Oxford in October of that year, had bought a house in the Paddocks in North Oxford, and they very kindly offered to let Nancy and me live there, rent-free and furnished, until we found our own house. Of course, it was a great pleasure to have Arthur and Mary near us after Nancy and I did find our own house, and to have Arthur as a philosophy colleague. One thing that stood out in Arthur's life was his enormous gift for dealing with children. He had a wonderful way of entering into their fantasies and sharing their concerns. This book that we have all got, The First Things in Logic, shows the enormous trouble that he would do to make things accessible to children, and yet serious things that were really worth learning. One of my own children were very young during Arthur's lifetime. The second was born in the same year as Arthur died. But one of the very useful lessons which Arthur gave to my elder son, Robert, when he was 1 year old, was how to go upstairs. There were a lot of stairs in the Prior's house. It was on 3 stories. And I can still see Arthur holding the heels of my baby son and moving them step by step upstairs, persuading him this was a better thing to do than crawling upstairs. So his gift for teaching ranged over the ages. For 66 to 9, we were colleagues at Balliol. At meetings of the governing body, Arthur always showed himself politically left-wing and socially progressive. He got on very well with the then master of the college, Christopher Hill, the Marxist historian. I remember him giving an eloquent speech in favour of the junior common room being given permission to install a contraceptive machine in their bar. We had a lot of number of talented pupils that we shared. Kit Fine had been here for some time before Arthur arrived. I had been his tutor and found it rather difficult to keep up with him intellectually. I was very glad when Arthur Prior arrived and was able to keep up rather better. Christopher Hitchens was a pupil of a rather different kind, but who went on to have a very distinguished and controversial life. Another of our favourite pupils, rather ironically, was John Hare, the son of Richard, who had beaten Arthur to the moral philosophy chair, and then Bill Newton-Smith, who was eventually to succeed Arthur as a Balliol philosophy tutor. During this time, Arthur continued to produce a number of papers, which were eventually collected by himself as Papers on Time and Sense. In 19 I think it was 1966 to 7, Arthur spent some time at the University of California, Los Angeles, and surrounded himself with a group of Californian logicians who gave an extra degree of formalization to his work. And this resulted in the book Past, Present and Future, which he published in 1967. In 1969, his first Balliol sabbatical came up. He spent it at Oslo with Dagfinn Follersdal. He had been suffering badly from rheumatism, and it was treated with cortisone in Oslo. And for a while, there was a remarkable recovery. I have a letter from him dated September 1969, in which he said, "I write to you as a miracle of modern medicine." Said, "I can stand on one leg and put a sock on the other for the first time for months." The letter, having described his health, moved on to discuss a point of modal logic that I had raised in a previous letter, and then on arrangements for access for a spastic student to his lectures. The letter was a very typical combination of abstract intellectual energy plus warm human sympathy, which was so characteristic of him. 10 days later, after writing this letter as a miracle of modern medicine, he was dead. I went with Martin to Norway for the cremation at Trondheim. I can still remember that bitter train journey from Oslo to Trondheim, watching the leaves falling through the windows. There was then, when we got back, a memorial service at Balliol. I think it's the only memorial service I have been to in which there were lengthy quotations from Vukašević. I was left to pick up various unfinished projects of Arthur. Norman Kretzmann of Cornell had come to Balliol as a visiting fellow for the years 69 to 70 and had come expressly to discuss medieval logic with Arthur Prior. When Arthur died, Norman decided there was no further point on coming into Balliol. It took me quite a while to persuade him that he should come in from time to time for lunch, and we might, even though I didn't know much about medieval logic, we might discuss philosophy together. That was the beginning of another lifelong friendship. Norman and I and Jan Pinborg eventually published the Cambridge History of Later Medieval Philosophy together. And then there was a pupil of Arthur's, a medievalist, Francesco del Punta. Sadly, though I inherited him as a pupil, I was unable really to teach him in anything of the kind of thing that he wanted. But despite that, he went on to a very distinguished career in Pisa. Then, at Mary's request, I collaborated with Peter Geach in publishing posthumous works. The Objects of Thought was one, and a set of papers on logic and ethics. We gutted a book which Arthur had written long ago, The Craft of Formal Logic. He had cannibalized it himself in his other works, but there was enough to make a book called The Doctrine of Propositions and Terms. Geach and I were both admirers of Arthur, and it was very congenial working with Geach on the edition. But in the introduction, Geach and I had a rather had rather different philosophical styles. Mine was rather bland. Geach tended to be very pungent. John Lucas, who sat beside me on an airplane while I was correcting the proofs, Lucas maintains that he saw a sentence of Geach's which ran, Prior's work shows up the shoddy nature of that idiot Quine and that nincompoop Strawson. And John Lucas said he saw me rewrite it as, few people in this field have done more to illuminate it than Quine and Strawson, but even their talent and devotion pales by comparison. I don't think that's totally accurate, but it captures the sense of our relationship. There were also difficulties with the publisher, Duckworth. I don't know if any of you remember Colin Haycraft. Duckworth was an imaginative, Haycraft, who was the chief executive of Duckworth, was a very imaginative editor, but he was reluctant to pay royalties, and we waited months and months, and finally I sent him a letter saying, I don't much mind about my own royalties, but what about Prior's royalties? You're taking the bread out of the mouths of the widow and the orphan, and that did actually produce some royalties for a time. So much for my own reminiscences. I just want to put two small points of a theoretical nature. I think that one of the unique things about Arthur Prior was that I don't think I knew anybody else in this country who combined so well philosophy and formal logic. I've known, I think, more skilled logicians, and I think I've known better philosophers, but none who could do the two things so well together. I suppose Quine would be the obvious American example of somebody who was both an original logician and a philosopher. Prior had a great gift for brief, conclusive arguments. In this he resembled Peter Geach. You may remember that Peter Geach refuted the widespread scholastic thesis that in God essence and existence are the same thing by a brief dialogue. The theist says, there is a God. The atheist says, so you say, but what kind of thing is this God of yours? And the theist responds, well, I've just told you, there is one. The obvious nonsensicality of that is a wonderful example, I think, of bringing latent nonsense into patent nonsense. Now, a number of prior arguments, I think that the Prior's tonk, I see there's going to be a paper of it later on, against the idea that all you need for a system of logic is a set of introduction and elimination rules. So he has this connective tonk where from P you can derive P tonk Q, and from P tonk Q you can derive Q. Once again, you have a very brief argument which leads to a great deal of rethinking. And then his argument against the belief that the right action is the one with the best possible consequences. He says, well, either determinism is true or false. If determinism is true, then there's only one possible set of consequences. If determinism is false, then there are no consequences, no inevitable consequences. And so either way, to talk about doing the action which has the best possible consequences is futile. The question that I would like people to bear in mind during the conference is precisely the relationship between formal logic and philosophy. between the two disciplines that of which Arthur was such a master. The most recent conference I've been to was in memory of Georg Henrik von Rett in Helsinki, who perhaps after Arthur's death was my closest philosophical friend. Von Rett, of course, also was a distinguished modal logician and founded the discipline of deontic logic in a rather parallel way to Arthur's founding temporal logic. And shortly before his death, Georg Henrik said to me, "You know, deontic logic was a great mistake," by which I think he meant that it had failed to cast any real illumination on ethics. Others who in their youth have pinned hopes on formalization later reneged. Wittgenstein, the inventor of truth tables, was completely dismissive of any philosophical importance of Gödel's theorem, Gödel's incompleteness theorem, one of the most fascinating results of the ages. Bertrand Russell also de facto gave up formalization late in life. And even Frege, in old age disillusioned because of Russell's paradox, turned to rather more traditional methods of philosophizing in his later work. I would like to know whether this syndrome of enthusiasm for formalization in youth with a degree of disillusion later on, is this just part of the problem of human aging, or does it tell us something about the disciplines? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony, for some wonderful glimpses into the life and character of Prior, but also some very thought-provoking points, including, of course, not least your last two questions. We are a little bit over time, but I really found that so enjoyable and so important that I wouldn't have missed a minute of it. I think we should take one or two short questions if anybody would like to ask a question.
Sorry. I was just wondering, in connection to the very last thing you said, there is I think the perspective of what logic is has changed quite radically over the last 20 years. And there's all this work on the logic of action, the dynamic, epistemic logic, and so forth, which makes use of techniques, many of which go back to Prior. But I know of people who I think now have reached the age where you would say you might move away from the formal stuff in direction of philosophy, who still do it and who make this kind of connection with the Dutch logician Johan van Bentum, I think, is an example of that. But I mean, it's not much of a question, actually. But I feel that perhaps it isn't quite necessary that one moves away from the formal stuff. It's not really relevant to the philosophical issues as one becomes wiser and older.
I think that people like von Rett, I think, thought that the formal stuff is important, but as much for questions it raises as for questions it solved. I mean, you know, sort of the naive idea some of us once had that if only you could decide whether S4 or S5 was the correct system, then all problems about necessity and possibility would be solved, I think. But of course, I mean, the reason why I set this final question was that Arthur Prior died at the height of his powers, involved both in philosophy and logic. If he had lived to today, would he have gone through a von Writing, or would he still be, full and bouncy in both disciplines?
Thank you. And I'll skip over.